Hello. Today I would like to show you how you can use iZotope RX to go through an audio file and remove breaths. Now, the techniques we're going to look at today will work with the standard and advanced versions. Unfortunately, they will not work with the Elements version. But if you have the standard or advanced version, you're all set. So I'm running iZotope RX 10 Advanced, and what I have here is the sample of an audio file that I recorded recently for a DaVinci Resolve tutorial. So let's just take a quick listen. And Fusion. Now, FU and Fusion are the same object, and here's how I know. Okay, there we go. The first thing I would like to do is identify what breaths look like, and then we'll go through 3 different ways we can remove all the breaths. First, let's zoom vertically. There we go. And then let's zoom horizontally and go to the beginning. Now, let's scroll through and let me show you what a breath looks like. If you've edited a lot of audio, you've probably developed this sense of pattern recognition where you see this is the waveform with the loudness of my speaking, and the telltale signature for a breath is something that looks like white noise at a significantly lower volume than the speaking around it. So here, for example, is a breath. And if you scan further to the right, you can see another one here. But not all of them look that way. Like, what about this, for example? Is that a breath? No, that's probably mouth noise related to a word. Let's see. It'll work with Python version. Yeah, so that's not really a breath. It's kind of breath-like, but it's part of the spoken word. Now, here is another example of a breath. And you have these little vertical lines before it. That's a typical signature for mouth noise. So let's listen to this. Yeah, that little explosive where actually it's just the lips sticking together a little bit. And whenever you listen, like you magnify or you really focus in on audio, you start to hear the sound of someone's mouth. This could be a little breath, or it could be spoken word. But here is another clear breath. Okay, so we now started to develop a sense of what a breath looks like. It's white noise at a reduced volume. If you pick spoken voice and zoom in, you will see the harmonics. It will have this oscillatory nature to it. But if you zoom in on breath, it will look like noise, like static. So with that in mind, how can we remove these breaths? And the goal or the challenge is to remove just the breaths and not interfere with the spoken word. Now, each one of the techniques will have its pros and cons. The first one is to listen through the audio, and every time you hear a breath, surgically select it and make whatever change you want to it. So for example, if you were to, let's just pick a place somewhere in the middle of it, so we're not at the very beginning. Let's say we're right here. Let's go back here. Just clear the shell. Okay, so you hear a breath there. So you could select it, and then if you want to reduce the volume, for example, you could take the gain effect and just turn it down. You could also turn on instant process if you want to just have it instantly adjust the gain when you select it. This is the most precise because every single breath is a little bit different than the others. Sometimes they can be significantly different, but in general, you know, no 2 breaths are exactly the same. And by doing this, it allows you to tailor your edit to every single breath. Unfortunately, so that's the pro, is how much precision it gives you. The con is how much time it takes. And if you're making content for YouTube, social media, and other rapid turnaround content, you just can't afford to spend days or maybe even weeks going through large audio files doing that type of surgical adjustments to breaths. The next thing is, if you come over to the right, there's a lot of different tools, and they're grouped into 3 groups, which I've collapsed. So by default, it's probably expanded, but I'll collapse them here. The top group is called Repair, and there is a tool called Breath Control. And let's select the default as something to start off with. Now, it has a nice checkbox feature that says Output Breaths Only. If you turn that on and click Preview, you hear the noises that iZotope thinks are breaths. And in this sample that we picked, you could hear that one was a breath and the other was just mouth noise related to speaking, or it may actually have been some of the syllables themselves. Listen, I'll start right here. Listen one more time. Okay, so now if you listen to the pure audio button, that will just clear the shell. When I say clear the shell, I hear a little bit of, the sound of my tongue. That will just clear the shell, but it's not a breath. So, but it did catch this breath. So when it identifies something that it thinks is a breath, but is not, that's a false positive. Now, on the other hand, it'll sometimes pass over a breath and not catch it, and that's a false negative. It looked at it, it thought, no, negative, that's not a breath, I'm just going to pass over it, but it turns out it was wrong. It was a false negative. So the goal is to take this breath control tool, adjust the dials up and down, this, that, and the other, until you get a setting which gives you the best compromise. But at the end of the day, it is a compromise. Ideally, you'd like to have no false positive, no false negatives. It would only catch the breaths, but that's just not going to happen. So what you'll probably end up doing is making sure that it catches a lot of the breaths, but none of the spoken word. And so you might end up using one of the presets, such as gentle breath suppression, which will do a slight decrease in volume, and the sensitivity is not terribly high. But there are other things like silence breaths altogether, or heavy breath suppression, where it's much more aggressive. And there you're going to encounter the problems that it's going to have a lot of false positives. It's going to start to interfere with the sound of the spoken word. So let's see some examples in this case. So I did, before starting here, I went through and looked for some false positives and negatives to show you. One was at 2 minutes and 53 seconds. At the global timeline at the top, you can see where the playhead is and what's the current region on display. Let me just scroll over so we can find it. So let me bring back the breath control, and let's start with the default. And once again, let's only output the breaths. So let's hit preview and see what it sounds like. Okay, so you hear the and then the breath. So here is the breath, which we did want it to catch. But in this little bit of audio here, which I'll play, con matches what their functionality is. Con matches. So in that bit of voice, there's no breaths, but if we do this preview again, it was taking a lot of the voice and thinking it was a breath. So there's one case where it was being a little too aggressive. So you then might have to take and dial down the sensitivity, or dial up the sensitivity. So here's a case where you would have to adjust the sensitivity to make sure that you're not catching that. So for example, if you're hypersensitive, and start it here again, it's catching much too much. But if you bring the sensitivity down, let's not go all the way down, let's keep it like to 30 and play back. Okay. It caught this breath, but it still caught something in here. So this is kind of the game you would have to play, is you'd have to go through and listen to a large part of your audio, adjusting the sensitivity slider, maybe how much target you want to do, so how much you want to adjust the loudness of breath reduction, so that if it does ever make a mistake, it's not going to be so distracting. This tool is useful for a good first pass, but the trade-off is the first pass is very quick. There's still the con that it will sometimes be a little too aggressive or not aggressive enough, which means you're still going to have to go and listen to your entire audio in order to find anything that you need to undo or something that it missed and you want to clean up. Let me show you another example. This was a false negative where it just missed a breath altogether. I think it was a 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Let's jump there. Here's the playhead at the global stripe, and here's the current window. Let's just scroll up. And so here is a breath. You can see that, and here is a larger breath. So let me put the playhead here, and we'll play. And I think if we set this to default, let's see if it catches this breath. I have a feeling it may not. Let's see. It didn't. So this was an example of a false negative. It didn't think this was a breath, so if I highlighted this region and said, and uncheck the output breaths only and render, it doesn't catch this breath. I mean, we can hear it, but for whatever reason, the breath control tool did not catch it. So let me undo that. So that is the second technique. So first was go through and handle every single breath individually. Very precise, very time consuming. Breath control balances that a little better. It's a lot faster, but it's not as surgical. And so now I would like to show you a different way. And that's going to require us to use a tool called Find Similar. Now, the way this tool works is you can go through your audio file and look for events, something that you would like to search your entire audio file for additional copies of it. And in our case, we're looking at breaths. So everyone's breaths are different, but in this audio file, since it's me speaking for a long time, my breaths are very similar to each other. So here's a typical breath. What I mean typical, or I might even describe this as a clean breath, meaning there's not a lot of mouth noise, there's no pops and smacks and things like that. I got lucky here, and it's just a nice clean breath. Let's listen to it. So you just hear the sound of the air going in, and you don't have this little vertical line, which is the signature of mouth noise. So let's take and highlight this. Once we've highlighted this, let me close the breath control tool. We're not going to use that here. We're going to now open the Find Similar tool. It has three options: Find Previous, Find Next, and Find All. Just as our first glance into this, let's click Find Next. It'll take a little moment. It's going to go through, and you see it just jumped a few milliseconds forward here. We started here, and it did jump and find the next breath there, because that breath is very similar to this one. So let's do this again. Now I want to point out another thing is not only did it find the next breath, but it highlighted it as well. Now the highlight isn't perfect. It didn't go to the very, very beginning of the breath. So it seems like it tried to match things a little bit on length and characteristics. And as a result, it didn't expand the length enough, but it did a pretty good job. Now here is where it gets really fun. If you highlight this, you can also click Find All. So let's do that now. So that's pretty fast. Now, if you look at the top global view, you'll see all these gray vertical lines. What those are, if we scan through and move through, you will see it's actually all the matching breaths that it found, and they're already highlighted, which is amazing. So you don't have to go through and highlight each one individually to do anything. They're all highlighted for you. Now, here's an example of one of the drawbacks of this technique. It only caught half of this breath. The one highlighted here, it missed the beginning altogether, but it did highlight all of them. So now at this point, there's two things you could do. One is you could adjust the similarity, but let's just leave it at default. Let's not go down that fork in the road. The other is you could say add markers. Let me do add markers here. And this takes a little moment. You can see right now the add markers button is grayed out. And so it's doing a lot of thinking. This does take a fair bit of time. And so let me just there we go. It's now done. And so what this did is it added a marker at every single place where it identified a matching event, or what it thought was a breath in this case. Now there is a window that you can bring up of markers and regions. Let me show you where you can get that from not using the keyboard shortcut, which is Alt-M on Windows. You can come up to the window menu and select markers and regions. And what this does is it gives you a table that lists all the markers in your timeline. And if we scroll down, they're numbered starting with 0, so there's actually 126 since we started counting to 0. There's 126 events or markers that it identified as a possible breath. So now what you could do is go to the beginning and use keyboard shortcuts to jump from marker to marker and make an edit. So that's starting to now feel a little bit like the first approach of doing a surgical change if you want. But if nothing else, this is a good thing to use in that case. Is, let's see, is it Control right arrow or Alt right arrow? Alt right arrow, at least on Windows, allows you to go from marker to marker. So you could go through and find what was kind of bookmarked as a breath, select it, and make a change, go to the next one, select it, make a change. And don't forget, when you do this, you could say instant process this. And what the instant process does is when you select it, it automatically applies whatever effect you've selected here to that region. So that allows you to just select, and go on to the next one. And so this is a pretty fast way of doing it. And so this will save you a lot of time if you want to do surgical removal. But let's undo all of these and go back to the initial audio file, and let's clear all the markers. To clear all the markers, I'm just going to bring up the markers and regions, select them all, and remove them. So here is another way to go about that. Let's once again look for a standard breath. Here's something. Oops. Let me turn off this instant process. Let's listen to this. That's a bit of a long breath. Let's look for a little shorter, more standard looking breath. Here we go. So here's a standard looking breath. Okay, pitch is a little bit different, but it's shorter. This will work. So I'm going to select this, come over to Find Similar, and say Find All. So it found them very quickly, and by the looks of this, there's probably close to 100 breaths that it has identified. So now what you could do is come over to the tools once again. Under Utility, there's Gain, and let's say you want to just turn down the volume of everything that's selected right now. Let's say -12. Do that, and if you do a render, in fact, before I do a render, let me come over here and find a place where there's multiple regions selected on the screen at once. So here's 3 different breaths that are highlighted, or I should say matching events, and they are breaths, but the selection region isn't perfect, but let's go with it. If I click render, there you go. You can see that they were all turned down very well. And let's play back and see if we hear any distortion. Reformatted this into a nice to read document and uploaded it to GitHub. And okay, so this into a nice, the breaths now aren't nearly as distracting as my breaths normally are, and I'm not hearing any distortion. So this is a third way to go about reducing breaths, and that is find a standard breath, come over to Find Similar, Find All, and then if you want to just reduce, you can either silence them, you can, but I would never be that aggressive. I would just probably take gain down to like -12, -15, something like that. And then what you could do is move on with any other voice adjustments you want to make, click, pop reduction, S reduction, and things like that, and then start editing. And then what I would recommend is just listen. If you ever find a breath that is distracting, then come back to iZotope and fix it. Or if it ever did kind of distort the audio, then you might want to go through and make a few changes. But in general, my experience has been the Find Similar does a pretty good job. And it does make sense when you stop and think about it, because what it's doing is it's finding other things or other breaths that match one of your breaths. So it's not like this standard breath tool that you can use on anyone. This is saying, I want to find those bits of audio that sound just like a sample of one of my breaths right now. And that, those are the 3 ways I wanted to talk to you. But before we go, I do want to talk over the pros and cons of the Find Similar. The pros is that when it does the search, is it's using your breath, a standard breath, as the template to identify breaths. The cons is, as we saw, sometimes the selection region isn't ideal. So you might want to either tinker with them, or you might want to go through and add markers to where all the breaths or all the search results were, and go one by one and do a quick reduction that way. So the 3 ways that we talked about was surgical, breath by breath. Second was the breath control. Third was the Find Similar. And you can mix and match all of these. So if you wanted to, you could always do breath control with a very gentle reduction, so it's not going to be very aggressive. Then you could do something like Find Similar and do another round of reduction, and then just play through before you move forward with production and see if there's anything missed. And then you could do maybe a little bit more surgical changes here and there. But in general, pick one or any of these methods, and I think you will find that iZotope will do a great job reducing the breaths for you. So I hope you found this helpful. If you know any other tricks, by the way, that to reduce breaths that either use the tools that we talked about in a better way, or there's other tools that we didn't talk about that can also do something like that, let me know, because iZotope is a pretty powerful tool, and I think it's great if we can all learn from each other. So I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you in the future.